20 years ago, China made a quiet decision to build a secret escape route from the Strait of Hormuz. And in March of 2026, that decision just saved their entire economy. While the rest of the world panics over closed shipping lanes and $100 oil, Beijing is sitting on top of 1.3 billion barrels of crude buried inside underground caverns along their coastline. That's nearly double the maximum capacity of America's entire strategic petroleum reserve, hidden in solid rock, invisible to satellites. You heard that right, nearly double. And the underground reserves are only one piece of a 20-year chess move you're about to watch checkmate the world in real time. To understand how China pulled this off, you have to go back to the moment they realized they were trapped. The original sin, 2 wars that changed everything. Picture yourself sitting inside a quiet government office in Beijing in January of 1991. The television is on, and what you're watching isn't a war, it's a demonstration. Operation Desert Storm is unfolding in real time, and every Chinese strategist in that room understands exactly what they're seeing. The United States Navy has just shown the entire planet that it can shut down the Persian Gulf whenever it wants. Tankers move when Washington allows them to move. Oil flows when Washington allows it to flow. And the most important waterway on Earth, the Strait of Hormuz, is functionally an American leash wrapped around the throat of every oil-importing nation on the planet. Now here's what makes that moment so terrifying for Beijing. China had just crossed a line that same year. After decades of being a net oil exporter, they had quietly become a net oil importer. The trajectory was obvious. Within 10 years, maybe 15, they would be drinking from the same Persian Gulf straw as everyone else. And the country holding that straw had just demonstrated on live television that they could pinch it shut anytime they wanted. But the real gut punch came 12 years later, March of 2003, the invasion of Iraq. And this time, the lesson wasn't just about controlling oil flow. It was about regime change. It was about reshaping entire countries. It was about the casual willingness of the United States to redraw the Middle Eastern map whenever it served American interests. Chinese leadership watched Baghdad fall and understood something chilling. If Washington could do this to Iraq, Washington could do this to any oil supplier China depended on. That same year, President Hu Jintao stood in front of senior Communist Party officials and gave the fear a name. He called it the Malacca Dilemma. The cold mathematical reality that roughly 80% of China's crude imports pass through choke points patrolled by the United States Navy. Hormuz at one end, Malacca at the other. 2 narrow stretches of water, both controlled by a country that increasingly viewed China as a strategic rival. And in that moment, a decision was made that would shape the next 20 years. It wasn't a policy. It wasn't a 5-year plan. It was a vow. Never again would a single choke point hold the Chinese economy hostage. Never again would Beijing wake up wondering if today was the day Washington decided to turn off the tap. You're about to watch them keep that vow in ways that almost nobody outside of China saw coming. And the first move on the board started not in the Middle East, but thousands of miles north in the frozen forests of Siberia. Escape route number 1, the pipeline through Siberia. Now shift your attention north, far north, to a place where the ground stays frozen 10 months out of the year, and the nearest ocean is more than 1,000 miles away. Because this is where China laid the very first brick of their escape route, and they did it in a place no American aircraft carrier could ever reach. You're looking at the ESPO pipeline, the Eastern Siberia Pacific Ocean Pipeline. A steel artery thousands of miles long, snaking out of the Russian wilderness and crossing directly into the Chinese city of Daqing. And here's what makes this piece of infrastructure so quietly devastating. Not a single drop of the oil flowing through it ever touches salt water. Not one. No tankers, no straits, no choke points. No foreign navies standing between the wellhead and the refinery. The first agreements were signed in the mid-2000s, while America was distracted in Iraq and Afghanistan. The first oil started flowing in 2011, and then came the expansions. 2018, 2020, 2022. Each one quietly increasing capacity, while the world's attention was somewhere else entirely. But the pipeline was only half the play. Because in 2019, a second steel artery came online, the Power of Siberia natural gas pipeline, another massive piece of infrastructure, pumping Russian energy directly into Chinese homes and factories without ever touching an ocean. And then negotiations accelerated for Power of Siberia 2, an even larger pipeline that would lock in Russian gas for decades to come. Then something happened that nobody in Beijing could have scripted any better if they'd tried. In 2022, the West cut Russia off. Sanctions, bans, frozen assets, European countries scrambling to wean themselves off Russian energy. And suddenly, Moscow had exactly one serious customer left on Earth, with the infrastructure already in place to absorb their oil and gas at massive scale. Just one. China didn't just get energy. They got it at a discount. They got it on their terms. They got it paid in yuan instead of dollars. And they got a Russian leadership so desperate for revenue that the negotiating leverage flipped almost entirely in Beijing's favor. By 2024, Russia had become China's single largest crude oil supplier. Millions of barrels per day equivalent flowing through pipelines that no blockade could stop, no airstrike could easily destroy, and no foreign navy could intercept. But here's where it gets even more incredible. Because the pipeline through Siberia was never meant to be the only escape route, it was just the northern door. And while the world was watching Russia and Ukraine, China was quietly carving open a second door, this one punching directly through the mountains of Pakistan, all the way down to the Arabian Sea. Escape route number 2, the Pakistan Gambit. Pull up a map in your mind. Find China's western edge. Now trace your finger down through the Karakoram Mountains, through Pakistan, all the way to a small fishing town on the Arabian Sea that almost nobody in the West had even heard of 20 years ago. A place called Gwadar. Because what you're looking at is the boldest piece of the entire escape plan. Here's what Chinese strategists figured out around the early 2000s. If they could somehow punch a corridor straight through Pakistan highways, railways, pipelines, the works, they could land oil tankers at a port that sits just outside the Strait of Hormuz. Then move that oil overland by truck and pipeline and rail, all the way up into Western China. No Malacca Strait, no South China Sea. No long, vulnerable tanker journey through waters patrolled by foreign navies. Just a straight shot from the Arabian Sea to Kashgar. The plan got a name in 2013, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC for short. And the price tag was staggering, over $62 billion committed to highways, power plants, railway lines, fiber optic cables, and at the southern end, a deep water port at Gwadar, leased to a Chinese state-owned operator for 40 years. 40 years. You heard that right. Beijing didn't just invest in the port. They effectively took operational control of it for nearly half a century. And what they're building at Gwadar is genuinely something to behold. A deep-water port designed to handle the largest oil tankers on Earth, pipelines and rail lines heading north into China. Storage facilities, refineries, an entire energy ecosystem dropped onto a coastline that bypasses the most contested waterway in the world. But here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Because CPEC hasn't been smooth. Insurgent attacks in Baluchistan have killed Chinese workers. Cost overruns have stretched timelines. Pakistani political instability has slowed construction at critical moments. Critics in the West have spent years calling the whole project a white elephant billion sunk into a port that barely operates at full capacity. And on paper, those critics aren't entirely wrong. But here's what they keep missing. Strategic infrastructure isn't measured by today's throughput. It's measured by what it does to your enemy's playbook. Even a partially operational Gwadar fundamentally changes the calculation in Washington. Every barrel that lands there is a barrel Washington can't squeeze. Every mile of pipeline heading north into China is a mile of leverage subtracted from the Pentagon. Think about what just happened over the last 20 years. The United States spent trillions of dollars and thousands of American lives fighting wars across the Middle East. China spent a fraction of that money building a backdoor that makes the Middle East itself less relevant to their economy. Two completely different strategies. And in March of 2026, you're about to see which one actually worked. Because escape routes through Russia and Pakistan are powerful, But they only matter if you can survive the gap between when the crisis hits and when those routes can ramp up. And that's where the third piece of China's plan gets truly insane. A hidden underground empire most people on Earth don't even know exists. Escape route number 3, the underground empire. Now take your attention, underground. Literally, hundreds of feet beneath the Chinese coastline, into a world almost nobody on Earth has ever seen. Because while most people picture oil reserves as those big white cylindrical tanks sitting in fields somewhere, what China has been quietly building for the last 2 decades is something completely different. Massive underground caverns carved directly into solid coastal rock. Storage chambers so enormous you could fit entire skyscrapers inside them. And the scale of what they've built will genuinely stop you cold. The construction started in 2004. Phase 1. A handful of facilities along the coast in Zhejiang and Shandong provinces. Then Phase 2 kicked off in 2009, dramatically expanding capacity. Then Phase 3. Then expansions on top of expansions, stretching all the way through the 2020s. And the total storage capacity China has built across commercial and strategic reserves combined, estimates run as high as 1.3 billion barrels of oil. 1.3 billion barrels. You heard that right. Buried in caverns most satellites can't even see, hardened against airstrikes, and quietly sitting there for the exact moment the world is going through right now. To put that in perspective, that's enough oil to replace every single barrel China imports for months on end. Not days, not weeks, months. Long enough to outlast almost any conceivable crisis. Long enough to wait out wars. Long enough to fundamentally change the diplomatic leverage of any country trying to squeeze them. But here's what makes the Chinese reserve so much more dangerous than America's Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The American SPR is stored mostly in salt domes along the Gulf Coast known locations, well-mapped, well-documented. Anyone with a satellite and a basic understanding of geology knows exactly where that oil is sitting. The Chinese reserves? Carved into solid rock, often deep underground, spread across coastal provinces, in locations that have never been fully disclosed. You can't bomb what you can't find. You can't sanction what you can't see. You can't pressure a country into using up reserves you don't even know the size of. And this is where the entire strategy starts to come together. Because pipelines from Russia give China supply. Gwadar gives China alternate routes. But the underground empire? That gives China something far more valuable than oil itself. It gives them time. In any geopolitical standoff, time is the single most expensive commodity on the table. The country that can wait longer wins. The country that runs out of options first loses. And China just spent 20 years making absolutely certain they would never be the country running out of options first. But even with pipelines, ports, and underground caverns, there was still one problem left to solve. And the way Beijing solved it might be the most counterintuitive piece of the entire 20-year plan. A strategy so quiet that most Western analysts laughed at it for years before realizing what it actually was. Escape route number 4, the renewables avalanche. Now consider the strangest weapon in China's entire arsenal. It isn't a pipeline. It isn't a port. It isn't a hidden cavern full of crude. It's a solar panel, a wind turbine, a nuclear reactor, an electric car. Because somewhere along the way, Beijing figured out something the rest of the world is still struggling to understand. The fastest way to escape the Strait of Hormuz isn't to build another route around it. It's to stop needing the oil that flows through it in the first place. And the scale of what China has done over the last 15 years is almost impossible to wrap your head around. Start with solar. In a single year, China has been installing more solar capacity than the entire United States has installed across its entire history, cumulatively. You heard that right. 1 year of Chinese installation versus every solar panel ever bolted onto a rooftop, parking lot, or desert facility in America since the technology was invented. That's the gap. Now layer in wind. Massive wind farms stretching across the grasslands of Inner Mongolia and the high deserts of Gansu. Turbines as tall as skyscrapers, generating enough electricity to power entire provinces. Then, add nuclear. China is currently building more nuclear reactors than the rest of the world combined, with new plants coming online at a pace that hasn't been seen anywhere on Earth since the 1970s. Then there's the high-speed rail network, tens of thousands of miles of electrified track that have functionally replaced short-haul domestic flights across most of eastern China. Every one of those trains runs on electricity generated mostly from sources that have nothing to do with Middle Eastern oil. But the real killer is what happened with electric vehicles. In 2024, more than half of all new vehicle sales in China were electric or hybrid. More than half. You heard that right. While American car makers were still arguing about whether EVs were a real market, Chinese consumers were buying tens of millions of them. Every single one of those cars is a vehicle that doesn't need gasoline refined from imported crude. Every single one is a small middle finger pointed directly at the Strait of Hormuz. And now, here comes the statistic that should genuinely change the way you see this entire story, the single number that reframes everything you thought you knew about China and oil. Oil passing through the Strait of Hormuz now accounts for just 6.6% of China's total energy consumption. 6.6%. 20 years ago, that number was close to 30%. So while the Western press spent the last decade mocking Chinese renewables spending as wasteful overcapacity, while analysts called it state-subsidized distortion, while critics insisted Beijing was throwing money into solar panels nobody needed, China was quietly executing the most effective energy security program in human history. They didn't just build escape routes around the choke point. They shrank the choke point itself until it barely mattered. And then March of 2026 arrived. The moment every piece of this 20-year puzzle was designed for. The moment Hormuz finally closed. The moment the rest of the world discovered, in real time, that they had been playing checkers while Beijing had been playing chess. The checkmate March 2026. Now come back to the present moment. March of 2026. The Strait of Hormuz has just slammed shut. And this time, you're going to watch the crisis unfold with everything you now know. Tankers are stranded outside the strait, idling in formation, their captains waiting on insurance underwriters who have stopped writing policies for the region entirely. Oil futures spike past $100 a barrel within hours of the closure. Then, 110. Then, 120. The screens in trading rooms from London to Singapore turn an angry shade of red and stay there. In Manila, the Philippine government calls an emergency session and declares a national energy crisis. They have no pipeline to Russia. They have no Gwadar. They have no underground caverns full of strategic crude. They have no solar avalanche to fall back on. They are, in every meaningful sense, the country that China refused to become. In Canada, drivers wake up to gas prices that have surged 30% in a matter of days. Think about that for a second. Canada is one of the largest oil-producing nations on the planet. They export crude. They have pipelines running in every direction. And even they get hammered by the price shock, because that's how interconnected the global oil market actually is. When Hormuz closes, even the exporters bleed. In Tokyo, utility companies start burning through emergency reserves. In Seoul, refineries beg the government for sanctions waivers so they can buy from anywhere, anyone, at any price. In New Delhi, the finance ministry holds back-to-back crisis meetings as the rupee starts sliding against the dollar. In Brussels, European leaders convene emergency summits to figure out how to keep their economies from tipping into recession. In Washington, the president authorizes another release from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, knowing full well it's a finger in a dam that's already cracking. And then you turn your attention to Beijing. The lights are on. The factories are humming. There is no emergency address to the nation. There are no rationing announcements. There is no panic in the streets. There is no scramble at the gas pumps because tens of millions of Chinese drivers are charging their electric vehicles overnight from solar panels installed in Qinghai and wind turbines spinning in Inner Mongolia. Pipelines from Siberia keep pumping. Russian crude keeps arriving in Daqing. Tankers from Africa and Iran keep unloading at Gwadar, their cargo moving overland through Pakistan into western China. Underground caverns along the coast sit topped off, holding more than 1 billion barrels of insurance against exactly this scenario. The renewable grid keeps generating. The high-speed trains keep running. The economy absorbs the shock like a body that knew the punch was coming and braced for it 20 years in advance. Because it did. This is the moment every piece of the plan was built for. This is what the pipelines were for. This is what Gwadar was for. This is what the underground caverns were for. This is what the millions of solar panels and the tens of millions of electric vehicles were for. Every single piece of infrastructure, every single yuan spent, every single decade of patient construction was designed to deliver China to exactly this moment, standing upright while the rest of the world staggered. And here's the part that should genuinely give you chills. Nobody saw it coming. Not really. Western analysts wrote individual papers about CPEC. Energy reporters covered the ESPO pipeline. Climate journalists tracked Chinese solar installations. But almost nobody connected the dots. Almost nobody saw the entire 20-year mosaic for what it actually was. A geopolitical chess move so long, so patient, and so quiet that it looked like background noise right up until the moment of checkmate. The lesson you weren't supposed to learn. Now pull back and take in the full picture, because this story was never really about oil. This story is about time horizons. It's about the brutal, uncomfortable difference between a civilization that plans in 4-year election cycles and a civilization that plans in 20-year arcs. It's about what happens when one side is arguing about next quarter's earnings, while the other side is quietly pouring concrete for infrastructure that won't pay off until the 2040s. Think about what you just watched Beijing pull off. While Western democracies debated pipeline permits for a decade at a time, China built them. While American strategists cycled through 3 different Middle East doctrines, Chinese engineers were carving caverns into coastal rock. While European parliaments argued about climate targets that kept slipping further into the future, Beijing was installing solar panels at a pace that made every Western climate commitment look almost embarrassing by comparison. And the most unsettling part of this entire story isn't that China did it. The most unsettling part is that they told you they were doing it. Every step of the way. The pipeline agreements were public. The CPEC announcements were public. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve construction was public. The renewables targets were public. None of this was hidden. It was just boring. It was infrastructure. It was spreadsheets and concrete and steel, and it didn't trend on social media, so almost nobody paid attention until the strait closed, and suddenly the spreadsheets started writing the news. So here's the question you should sit with tonight. What is being built right now in 2026 that will quietly reshape the world in 2046? What 20-year chess move is already 5 years in, quietly unfolding while everyone's attention is locked onto the next election cycle, the next celebrity scandal, the next viral outrage? Because the most dangerous moves on the geopolitical chessboard aren't the loud ones. They're not the invasions. They're not the sanctions. They're not the diplomatic incidents that dominate headlines for a week and then disappear. The most dangerous moves are the ones that take 20 years, hundreds of billions of dollars, and the patience to never once explain what you're actually doing. Until one March morning, a strait closes on the other side of the world, the lights stay on in Beijing, and the rest of the planet finally understands what just happened to them.